Medieval Europe had interesting ideas when it came to love, sex, and marriage. The themes that followed sexuality and marriage in the Middle Ages were not as weird as they were back in ancient times. Many historians think that this has more to do with the prevalence of religion, especially Christianity becoming an essential part of the state. Love and sex have always been important parts of human life, and this was also true during the Middle Ages. However, the way that love and sex were understood and expressed during this period was different from modern society in many ways. Many things that were considered typical in ancient times were now taboo in medieval Europe. Some argue that this was for the good because things like incestual relationships were immoral and wrong, hence the stigma around it in medieval Europe was a good thing. However, others argue that because of a stricter code of morality people had to follow, it made them repressive and made sex a not-so-normal part of their lives. It was not only sexuality that differed in medieval Europe. Due to a prevalence of chivalrous behavior, love had also taken a new form. A kind of love that focused on unattainable but complete submissiveness to one's partner was unique in its ways. The concept of a knight in shining armor gained popularity around the Middle Ages. And with that, there was also a shift in how marriages were viewed. While many were still arranged by parents, similar to how it was in ancient civilizations, choosing who you can marry was also becoming a norm. Even though the Middle Ages have been known for the rekindlement of technological and human development, I think it is also important to analyze people's everyday lives. And what better way to do so than by looking at love, sex, and marriage in medieval Europe? Love in medieval Europe has been extensively covered in literature around that time. An abundance of literature focuses on traditional love where the couples have mutual respect and want to spend the rest of their lives together. However, a more unique concept that was widespread in the Middle Ages was that of courtly love. The idea of courtly love emphasized chivalry and being a person of good, noble character. This idea of love was initially based on fiction, and the literature surrounding it was mostly written to entertain royal members. When this concept was introduced to the public, it gained widespread acknowledgement and quickly became part of medieval Europe's culture. Most ideas of courtly love surround tales of knights that were willing to sacrifice everything for the honor and love of their women. The fictional stories revolved around the knight's complete submissiveness to his lover. A true knight must be willing to do everything that his lady desires. Soon, these stories would result in people thinking that to practice courtly love was equivalent to being enriched and fulfilled. What is interesting about this kind of love is that it need not be based on marriage. During the Middle Ages, love was often seen as a powerful force that could inspire great acts of chivalry and bravery. Courtly love, a type of love that developed in the High Middle Ages, involved the idea of a nobleman being chivalrously devoted to a woman of higher social standing, often a married woman. This type of love was often idealized and depicted in literature and art of the time. The idea of courtly love had more to do with the concept of loving rather than sex, although sex was an element of courtly love as well. That meant this kind of love, especially as described by poets in France at the time, was based on a secret union where the two lovers could only love from far away. These sorts of unattainable relationships were increasingly romanticized, and even literature surrounding courtly love usually ended in death and tragedy. It is crucial to note that women were viewed as more respectable in medieval Europe due to an emphasis on women and the exaltation of femininity. The idea of an ideal woman was someone that was married to a lord and had considerable power in the household. She was to be the head of the family when the lord was away and controlled all matters of the family and cultural importance. While this was a breath of fresh air in the aura of strict patriarchal structures that gripped most societies, it is essential to note that this was only very prevalent in the noble class. Some historians also claim that courtly love allowed people to break free from a strictly arranged marriage setup that preceded the Middle Ages. Marriages in the Middle Ages were as anything that you wanted them to be. They could take the form of lavish feasts and ceremonies indicating that the couple was now to be together forever. Alternatively, you could marry your partner in the absence of any witness or priest from the comfort of your bed. Marriage in medieval Europe was hence fascinating, to say the least. Marriage during the Middle Ages was largely a matter of practicality and politics, rather than a romantic partnership. It was often arranged by families to secure wealth, land, and political alliances. However, this did not mean that love and affection were absent from medieval marriages. Many people in the Middle Ages fell in love and formed deep emotional bonds with their partners. The idea of marrying who you wanted was also becoming popular, mainly because the church supported it. Regardless of this, though, there were a lot of families that strictly believed in the arranged marriage system. Initially, women would rarely have the choice of who they could marry. However, as time passed, more and more choices were given to individuals who could marry without the couple needing permission from the family. Interestingly, when it came to the peasant class, the individuals were required to ask for permission from their masters if they wanted to get married. Marriage itself could happen in many ways. You could get married at a busy intersection, bar, or even at your friend's house. This shows that despite efforts by the church to be an essential part of marriage life, people were not required to marry in church. The only necessary thing was two consenting individuals. People who were engaged, expressed their desire to marry in the future, and could consent through words or actions. If the engaged couple had sex, it meant that they had given consent to marry, creating a legally binding marriage. It should be noted, however, that sex was not allowed outside of marriage. Instead, some laws allowed individuals to marry as soon as they hit puberty, so they would rather be married and have intercourse rather than be involved in premarital sex. Sexuality during the Middle Ages was also understood differently than it is today. While premarital sex was frowned upon, it was not uncommon for people to engage in sexual activity before marriage. However, the Catholic Church, which had a significant influence on medieval society, taught that sex should only be engaged for procreation within the confines of marriage. Homosexuality was also not widely accepted during this period, and same-sex relationships were often punished by the church and the state. Proving marriage was vital to people in medieval Europe because they could not have sex without proof of marriage. However, as weddings in the Middle Ages were not very formal, it was hard to prove that one was married. This situation was exacerbated by the lack of needing witnesses to be married formally, as according to Christians, God was the ultimate witness. Hence, proving one was married became cumbersome. This was until the 12th century when the clergy announced that being married was a sacred, holy thing and should not be taken lightly. Attaching a religious connotation to marriage meant that it was taken more seriously. More interesting was the concept of divorce in medieval Europe. Once you were married, you were expected to stay married. There were exceptions, of course, but divorce was usually cumbersome in the vast majority of instances. To end a marriage at the time, you had to either prove that the union did not exist in the first place or prove that you were too closely related to your partner to be married. Another reason to file for divorce was if he failed to adequately please his woman in bed. A council was set up which would monitor the sexual activity of the couple, and if the man was incapable of satisfying the woman, it would serve as legal grounds for divorce. Interestingly, a man could not divorce his wife just because she failed to provide him with a male heir. It was considered the will of God if the couple had a daughter. In a time where the church had a lot of say in state affairs, it was only logical that attempts were made to curb who, when and where one could have sex. People could not have sex on Sundays, Thursdays, or Fridays due to religious reasons. There were also long periods of abstinence that were to be observed when practicing Christians were fasting. If anyone was to deviate from the set rules while having intercourse, they were committing a grave sin. These kinds of beliefs were reflected in various literature throughout the Middle Ages. There was a complete ban on oral and anal sex in parts of Europe, and masturbation was also considered immoral. These bans were part of the penitentials, which were books that indicated what was allowed under the church rules and what was not. In medieval Europe, the church banned premarital sex, and one could only have sex with their spouse. There were wide-ranging taboos that were now part of medieval Europe. Some good stigmas like those on incestuous relationships meant that there would be less interbreeding. However, the stigmatization of homosexuality meant that people that expressed love towards the same gender were subjugated to punishments. Dante's Inferno places homosexuals in a tier lower heterosexual lustful individuals. Overall, the Middle Ages were a time of great cultural and social change, and attitudes toward love and sex were shaped by the values and beliefs of the period. Life when it came to love, sex, and marriage in medieval Europe were truly unique. While on the one hand, a special kind of love allowed women to feel more in power, but on the other, ideas of sexual repression grasped the Middle Ages in its claws. This repression, caused by an exceeding fear of being sinful, led to many stigmas and taboos surrounding sexuality lingering for centuries. In the words of Philip Larkin, it would not be until 1963 that sexual intercourse would begin marking the start of a sexual revolution. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more videos.